Hey boys and girls, I am back again with another video. Here I am going to go over a couple of new additions as well as something that I took off the bike that I am again going to give away at the end of this thing, and maybe talk about some work that I want to do either at the tail end of this season or going into the next. So let's get to it by talking about these new DEI titanium header wraps. Bow! Okay, so this video isn't going to show you exactly the step-by-step on how I went about installing these, unfortunately, but I will talk about some do's and don'ts based on my experience. And I do want to give a shout out to Messy Garage. I watched that video a few times before I got the courage to install this on my own. So if you do want some video reference on what to do to install your own, I would go check that out. But I do have some tips based on my experience that'll help you along the way as well. So let's get to it. So first things first, for those even considering header wraps, there's a couple reasons why people would want to do this in the first place. One is the look. It is more of a throwback look, but it also does a couple of things as well. It's supposed to better insulate the heat that's running through these things, which theoretically is supposed to improve performance. I don't know that it does that enough to be able to give any significant improvement in performance, but it also makes it so that the heat is more tolerable, the heat that's emanating off rather than just the exposed pipe. So what I did obviously was first began with taking off my Crusher Mavericks. You would have to take off your pipes. What I will say is that I installed these a few years ago and they were much more difficult to take off than stock. I maybe rode with the stock pipes for maybe 200, 300 miles, and they were fairly easy to take off. Obviously, with more miles and time, these were much more settled in and snug, so prepare for that fun. Once these are off, my first tip would be to remove one header at a time. I would start with the rear header. You would want to loosen it up at the access point and then loosen up this clamp that attaches it to the front header. Leave the front header on. Do not begin unscrewing that until the rear header is off. By doing that, you allow it to remain anchored, and so when you remove this rear header, you actually have to rotate it away from the bike and then separate it from this attachment point. Otherwise, if you undo them both, you really don't have the leverage to separate this rear header from the front header pipe. What I ended up doing was loosening them both, and it really couldn't come away from the bike without scratching or interfering with the engine or the frame of the bike. So I had to go back, tighten this, then remove the rear header, and then remove the front. It was a little bit of a headache. So tip number one, rear first, then the front. Another thing is obviously you have the fuel sensors attached here at this part of the rear header and right here attached to the front header. So make sure that you undo those before you remove the pipes all together. Once everything is removed, then begins the fun part of wrapping your heat wrap. Now I went with DEI titanium over your standard fiberglass wraps. Now the reason why I went with the titanium wrap is actually for a few reasons. One, it's supposed to do a better job of insulating your heat, and it also is supposed to be longer lasting and do a better job of protecting your materials underneath during the duration that you do have it wrapped. The other reason, and finally, is that it's supposed to be a lot more pliable out of the packaging. For your standard wrap, typically you have to let it soak for a little bit in water so that it's more pliable. This, you can begin wrapping it right out of the box without having to wet it, which makes for an easier job, a less messy job, and a quicker job. Now, that being said, Tip number 2, because it is titanium wrap, I just assume that I can just go in there with my bare hands and start installing it. Like with the standard fiberglass wrap, you should wear gloves. My hands were fairly itchy once I was done that evening, as well as during the next day a little bit. So the fibers really do get into your skin and onto your clothes. So wear some clothes that you really don't care about too much, and make sure you put on some gloves if you don't want that irritation. Now, tip number 3, I'm just going to tell you how I wrapped mine. So once you have everything removed, you'll essentially have 2 pieces that need to be wrapped. This header from here to here, and then this rear header that has this middle bridge piece that makes it just a little bit difficult. Now, the way that I went about it was I ended up wrapping this front part first. And once again, shout out to Messy Garage. I did start at the rear and worked my way forward. That way the lips are facing the back of the bike and not the front. If you have them facing the front, there's debris that can get caught up in there and make for some trouble potentially. So now the way that I went about wrapping this rear piece was I ended up using 2 different wraps to cover this up. I started the first wrap here at this top left end. As I went forward, I came long ways down this middle section. So you start here, you work your way around it, and then you work long ways, and then to continue through, rather than remain up top, you come down below. And then I anchored it here. So what you should have is sort of like a Z to start from here, that goes this way, goes long, and then comes out here. Boom, boom, boom. Now what that does is that leaves this now exposed, these sides exposed, and then this top right piece. So that was piece number 2. I went about starting here at the rear once again, and then when I came here, I wrapped it now sideways, also tightening up the long pieces that came long ways. And once you're done wrapping it through here, then you come up and out. So once again, you start here, top left, work your way forward, going long ways through this bridge, and then coming out through the bottom right, and then securing it. And then here to finish out. So you start here, going sideways, wrapping up any exposed sides and tightening this bridge, and then coming out top right. And that makes it so that you don't have to put any sort of zip ties around this area. It makes it nice and clean, and I'm fairly happy with the way that it came out. Once you have all that set and done, then you begin reinstalling everything back to the bike in reverse order. So you go front header, boom, rear header, clamp, pipes, set to go. I would say that it took me maybe about 4 hours of fun, but it was worth it. I still have my heat shields if I ever want to reapply them back onto the bike. I do like the look of it so far though. What I will say is that I have taken a trip since installing these. It was about a 7-hour round trip. It did feel like the pipes were emitting more heat than I was used to with the heat shields on. I still will be leaving those off, but for those considering it, you can always throw the heat shields right back on top of these guys, or DEI actually has these small heat shields for the parts where your legs are going to overlap with the pipe. So something for you to check out. I recognize that people either love or hate these things. It did take me a couple years to sort of even want to go forward with this, because it is sort of like a commitment. It's a lot of work taking it apart, applying it, and putting it back on. But I recently saw a couple bikes in person that had something similar on, and I was like, you know what, let's go for it. And I definitely don't regret it. All right, so now the other thing that I've done, as you can see on this side and on this side, is I've added these tank pads from Trip Machine. Now these are actually the mini tank pads, which fit the tank a lot better, but there's different size options if you go to tripmachine.com and check those out. For those that remember, I did have some tank pads that I installed myself from Tech Spec. Now Tech Spec did not have Scout specific tank pads, so what I ended up doing was buying the snakeskin textured strip and making a template I cut them out, I beveled them off, and I've had them on for a couple years and they were great. But because I have these Trip Machine wraps on the crash bars, on my grips, and leather everywhere else, I felt like this was like a nice little addition, especially now that I have this gold wrap. I thought it set it off really nicely. So the reason for these grips, obviously folks like to be able to sort of hug their tank with their legs for some, and for others like myself, because I have the matte paint from Indian, and those who also have matte paint know that it's very sensitive, so that there wasn't any wear over the years from my jeans rubbing or any possibility of scratching. I added on the tank pads for that extra level of security to protect it. Now, I did end up taking off the tank pads from Tech Spec that I made, and the tank was pristine underneath. No marks, no issues taking those off. I actually have them right here, and I'll talk about these at the end of the video. And I ended up putting these guys on. So I love the feel, I love the look, and those will be my new permanent stays on the bike moving forward. So that's been great. Now what I think I want to do next on this guy is replace this radiator guard. First off, it's plastic. It gives it like a little bit of a cheap feel, but also I did have to take out a rock or two here off the radiator, so I want to add some protection underneath with some wire. And if I'm going to do that, I also will then think about taking this off and putting on an aftermarket. There is one from Wunderkind that I am looking at, and that's probably going to be my next purchase and install. So maybe in the next month or two, that'll be the next thing that I put on. If anybody has one that they've installed and that they would recommend, please message me in the comments. I would like for it to be black without having to do any of the paint myself. So if there's something that sort of comes in either that finished black, that matte black, or even potentially a gloss black, depending on the look, let me know. I'd love to see some options that maybe I haven't considered yet. And so that's it. That marks the end of this video. The last time around, I did end up giving away two things. One being the leather tank bra that I had on the bike, as well as the Indian Scout specific Rockform phone mount, both to different viewers. Hopefully those found a home and those folks enjoy it. That being said, I still do have these tank pads that I used. They will need some new adhesive, obviously, for those that are looking to sort of throw these on their bike. Hit me up. If not, I do recommend these Trip Machine pads. Again, they're the Trip Machine mini tank pads, whatever model you go for, whether it's the leather, the diamond stitching, or the suede, or whatever it is, do go with the mini. They fit best. And for those that want to that don't want the leather on their bike and want a cheaper option, these worked out great. These look great. They looked stock when I put them on, so just pay for shipping and they're yours. So that being said, there's a lot more riding to be done this off season, so stay on two wheels, look out for the next video, and I'll see you on the road.